Good morning and Merry Equinox, Merry Vernal Spring Equinox to you all here on our YouTube channel. Um, Blessed to have you guys all here, taking a look at all of the wonderful content that we've had coming out from amazing and incredible practitioners and spiritual voices here on LifeGrove Media for our Equinox Jubilee. A little bit about me. My name is Christopher Lee. I am the CEO and founder of LifeGrove Media. I am a certified life coach, yoga teacher, meditation instructor, Reiki master, among many other things. Those are simply labels. But today I wanted to come to the live channel here because we're starting to get things like this set up on our channel finally, and do a little spiel of my own. Today I'll be talking about what I call integrative spirituality, and it is sort of a method or a way of charting your own unique individual spiritual experience. And I tried chatting about this yesterday to some extent. I only got about a third of the way through before I had to drop out. So as I promised, I'm back to talk about that today. So I guess a little background on integrative spirituality. This kind of came to me in a moment of inspiration. I was up in the mountains. I was hanging out in these wonderful, amazing waters up near Glenwood Springs, natural spring water, which, esoterically speaking, is a wonderful place to find inspiration, particularly if you follow some of the Celtic spiritual path. You find that there's a lot of inspiration from wells. So in this case, I kind of got hit with this burst of inspiration on the different layers of a spiritual aspirant's path. At the time, I was exploring a lot of my own ancestral spiritual traditions, being like Celtic and very Nordic spiritual traditions, from Druidry to some of the Norse Asatru spiritual traditions that we have in the kind of neo-pagan community today. And what I found was that there was three basic pillars to any one person's spiritual experience, particularly today in the modern world. And what I want to talk about today are those three pillars. The first one is what I call the primal or the deep connection. The second one is the pillar of what we're born into, what society has presented us with, what our parents have given us, and what our basic authority figures as we're raised from childhood into adolescence have impressed upon us. Kind of an act of domestication so that we fit in society. And then there's the kind of rebellious adolescence pillar, which leads us to explore divergent paths of spirituality, something that's wholly unique or totally different from what we were born with and what we were raised into. So let's dissect those a little bit really quickly. The primal pillar, or your deep connection, ties you ancestrally back through time, through what many practitioners have called kind of like your blood ancestry, your blood lineage, cleverly referred to by Raven Grimassi as the living river of blood. This is your connection to all of your ancestors, and this is something that exists in each and every one of us. And it's the first piece of spirituality that we need to explore, particularly in the modern world. And it's because many of us don't have access to our indigenous traditions, what our ancestors practiced daily or, even yearly. That is largely because of the 5 major world traditions, and of course there are many more living today, but, if we look at these monolithic institutions, these 5 major religions have kind of supplanted an almost seemingly infinite number of minor traditions that would have guided us on a DNA or a cellular level at some point in time. And so I think it's very important for us to start to get in tune with what it is calling to us in our blood. For instance, anytime I heard like some sort of neo-pagan, or even early on hearing some sort of Celtic tune, or what is presented to us now as a Celtic tune, say like an Enya song or something like that, there was something that called to me that I couldn't understand. But it was a spiritual experience. It wasn't just imagination, right? It was something that I couldn't quite pin down, either intellectually, emotionally, or physically. And so, what led me to this path was kind of wondering, why is it that I have these pulls to traditions that I'm not associated with. I wasn't raised in a Nordic community. I wasn't raised as an asatru or a druid in those traditions at all. I was raised Christian. Brought up evangelical, went to a Baptist school, was baptized into the Methodist faith. All of those things very divergent. So why was it that I felt this pull if I had never really truly experienced it? Well, as the theory with this methodology goes, is there's something about what's in your blood that you can't get rid of. I mean, it's part of you. It's part of your physical being. It's part of your incarnation. So you can't ignore it. It's going to be a vital part to unlocking more in your spiritual path. And if you are unwilling to explore it to some extent, you're cutting off a significant portion of what is your own personal mandala, right? Each of us is composed of a wonderful and beautiful amount of veins of spiritual experience that come together to make what is your unique spiritual experience. Nobody else gets to have this spiritual experience other than you, and it comes together from many different sources. And this is just one of those sources, and there could be multiple sources in your primal connection. You could be connected to many different traditions. And so one of the first steps that is afforded to us in the modern world is checking out our own ancestry, understanding exactly what our ancestry is. So you can take like an ancestry DNA test or 23andMe and start to dial these things in. That's something that we have access to now that maybe 2 or 3 or 4 generations ago was seemingly impossible. And so we have the ability now to track back through time and figure out where it is that we come from, which is really incredible if you think about it. This coming together of science and spirituality is magnificent, and I think that's very important to our own spiritual path, is tying these two things together. So once we've done that, right, you've kind of identified where it is that you come from. The cool thing is now as well, we have all of these reconstructionist traditions that are sprouting up as part of this new age spiritual exploration that many of us are kind of tapped into, particularly a lot of people here on LifeGrove Media. So you can now explore some of these things and see if they fit, right? See if there is something there for you. You're going to have ties to a lot of different things if you break it down. If you go and get an ancestry DNA test, or if you even just start playing around with like family trees, you're going to see where you tie into. You know, I've got a lot of Germanic, English, a little bit of Irish, some Scandinavian, and some Czechoslovakian. So there's a lot of different things in my very Euro aspect of ancestry, but I also have some native ties. So I in many ways have a resonance with Native American tradition because of my father's side of the family being Choctaw, and some loose connections to Lakota on my mother's side as well. And so I've explored a lot of that in my adolescence, and I didn't understand why. Why did I resonate with this? I wasn't raised this way. But it wasn't until I started exploring those that some of the pieces started coming together for me, right? And I started exploring these divergent paths, or things that I wasn't raised with, when I was in my adolescence, in kind of a rebellious phase, rebelling against what I was raised in, right? The kind of white Anglo-Saxon Christian world that many of us in Western society are raised under. Even if you didn't go to church growing up, this underpins so much of your perception of reality that it is something that we need to come to grips with. So that's the first pillar, right? Is this primal connection, exploring what it is that is within your DNA and your blood. Now, the second pillar of integrative spirituality is healing trauma associated with your domesticated spiritual traditions. And I see Amelia chiming in here on the live chat. Thanks for popping in, Amelia. Here's the most difficult part of integrative spirituality is healing the trauma associated with your domesticated spiritual tradition. The most difficult aspect of it is you didn't choose this, but it was impressed upon you from birth, almost. Every piece of Western society has this Judeo-Christian underpinning that supports it. And as we are somewhat rebellious in nature, human beings in general, we have a tendency to take what we were given instead of taking what's authentically ours and tossing it away. Now, that is very posh right now, right? You know, we want to rail against, say the church or other things like that. And there's a time and a place for those sorts of things. But what integrative spirituality helps us to kind of get a grips on is the good pieces of that puzzle, right? We can't throw away 20 years of what we were raised into. That's a part of who you are, and it will always be a part of who you are, and because it underpins so much more than just a religion, right? So much of our perception of the world is tied to this thinking, and it's very difficult to completely throw it under the rug. So in integrative spirituality, what we try to do is we try to heal the trauma associated with that. For instance, in my own personal spiritual experience, I suffered from night terrors. The church that I was raised into was very, let's just say hardcore. Because I was sensitive and because I was empathic, I was tapping into things that I think probably scared my parents, people in the church, and so I was kind of, for lack of a better term, ostracized in some ways, including to some extent a kind of an anointing or an exorcism of spirits that occurred when I was very young. Which made me deathly afraid of the Christian, iconography of demons and spiritual attack and spiritual warfare and all these sorts of things, which is a very fear-based tactic that didn't fit well with what I wanted to explore in Christian spirituality, which was this kind of loving, mercy-filled, forgiveness-filled spiritual path, the one that still resonates with me today with Yeshua of Nazareth. Many of us have had similar or even more horrifying experiences within the Judeo-Christian monolithic religion, and I empathize with that in everybody's case who have had a negative instance with the church. But you can't throw away your trauma, and you can't just shove it in a dark corner. It's not going to serve your spiritual path moving forward. What you have to do is you have to come to some sort of terms. And this can be done in many different ways, whether that's going through healing trauma, through some energy work, or kind of just coming to the table and saying, hey, okay, I was raised in this. I didn't choose it. There are some pieces that have served me, and there are some pieces that I am, at this point, going to reject and are not going to be a part of my story moving forward. Kind of like coming to a peace talks between you and this egregore that was formed for you. When I started to do this, I was about 23. I had to come to terms with all of these things. I had a lot of trauma around family at that time as well. And so I decided that I was going to fast and maintain abstinence for 40 days. I cut off basically anything that was a vice during the time period of Lent. And I then engaged in intense spiritual work leading up to my chosen baptism in the Methodist faith when I was 23 years old. There was a tremendous amount of healing that occurred throughout this process. It was remarkable. I made an entire film about it when I was in film school then. If I could find a copy of it, I'll probably release it in some way, shape, or form on LifeGrove Media. Because it was a very powerful experience for me. My youth pastor at the time was an incredibly, and still is, a very incredibly progressive Christian. Roger Woolsey, who's written a couple of books about progressive Christianity in general and how it can coexist instead of be exclusionary, be very inclusion based. And so I was able to tackle the pieces of my domesticated religion and spirituality that were incongruent with where I was growing on my own spiritual journey. And he was so gracious with this experience. He allowed me the leniency to explore things that maybe were outside of, say, the canon or even the doctrine of Methodism. He helped me to come to grips with some of the trauma that was associated with my childhood and being raised in the evangelical faith and in a Baptist church. And he helped me see the value of what was taught to me as I was domesticated as a child. And so I was able to come to terms with my domesticated faith in such a way that I was able to take the valuable pieces, the pieces that were very valuable to me and my future spiritual journey, and allay any kind of like negative karmic debt, for lack of a better term, that was associated. No ties, no energetic ties to feeling negative about what I was raised in. And so that is my own personal testimony and story around the second pillar. Now, each of us has to come to this in our own very unique way. So, that being said, many of us were raised under this particular tradition, even if your parents didn't take you to church or you never went to church. It's something that you have to come to terms with if you're going to progress on your own spiritual journey. And you can do that in many different ways. But the basis of this pillar is simply being willing to come to some sort of peace talk with that giant monolith that exists right in front of us. So that kind of leads me to the third pillar, which is exploring divergent paths. For many of us in the West, that divergent path in particular is some form of Eastern mysticism or Eastern religion. Now, if you look at Western society as a whole, just go back to the 60s, or even if you go back historically to the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was like a fire sale on all things Christianity. People were like, nope, don't want it. I want to explore different things. There was this influx throughout almost the entire century of the 1900s through 2000 of Eastern mysticism being imported into Western society via yoga, Tai Chi, Buddhism, Hinduism. All these different things came in, and people flocked to them for a number of really, really good reasons. Disillusionment with the Western spiritual traditions, along with the attraction of something a little bit more meditative. Now, in my own personal gnosis, my own personal experience, the Western spiritual tradition is really highlighted by a great deal of penetrative work. Okay, it's almost deductive which is where we get the link between Christianity and science, and the materialist scientific worldview that we have today. There's a kind of masculine, penetrative force behind it, and and that makes sense considering there's this monotheistic deity who, in many ways, is masculinized. And the Eastern tradition seems to be a lot more receptive, meditative, a lot of paths of non-doing, not doing things. And so that's very attractive to many of us because it's not something that we have access to as we're being raised. Now that is wildly changing for many children who are born into our society today, and I suspect there will be a balance point in the next few decades. But we're all attracted to this, particularly in adolescence, and so we try to explore many of these things. Many people get into yoga, meditation, all of the mindfulness, all the things that are packaged from the East and imported over here to the West. Reiki is a great example. And so we start to implement that. But after a while, what can occur, doesn't always, what can occur is there's this longing for something else. And there's a reason for that. It's because we have ignored the first two pillars, right? And so what you have to get to with these three pillars is some sort of integration where you say, I am interested in yoga, but I have unhealed trauma with my domestication in Christianity. And there's something else deeper that calls to me on a primal level, whether that's something in my past, in my ancestry. How do I take all these weird pieces that seem to not fit together and make them my own? That's a difficult prospect for many reasons. Number one, it's difficult to do because we tend to want to follow things A to Z. This is how you level up in Christianity. You go to church, you tithe, you do this, you do that, and then boom, we're in heaven, right? In yoga, I go to class, I keep getting better at my asana. Eventually, I'm into a state of meditation in my daily life, and boom, samadhi. That's not how your own unique spiritual mandala works. And it becomes increasingly difficult for you to achieve higher levels of awareness and liberation if you try to follow someone else's path. If you read in a book and you try to follow a book to the letter, you will get some gains, 100%. But if you don't put your own spin on things, if you don't put your own flavor, your own unique brand on the spiritual practice, by taking the things that work for you and leaving the things that don't, then you're not going to reach a synthesis, right? You can't ignore where you come from. You can't ignore the trauma of your past and just ditch it all for some other spiritual tradition, right? This has been the primary issue with religion throughout the years, is this theory that if somebody produces a map and everybody else follows it, everybody will achieve the same level of spiritual awareness or spiritual liberation. We're all unique individuals, even if that is kind of untrue in many ways. You're unique just like everybody else, which makes you not unique. What you have to do, and I'm not like promoting spiritual a la carteism here, where you take only the things that make you feel rosy and good, love and light, and those sorts of things. You have to come to grips with the darker sides of things too, which takes a certain amount of exploration into some shadowy areas. But on a whole, if you want to think about this represented symbolically, the best way to look at it is in creating your own art piece, your own mandala of sorts, and integrating all the symbols of the different things that you're attracted to, along with the things that you don't really get much of a choice in, right? So if I was going to create a mandala for myself, it would have some Norse iconography, some Celtic iconography, some Native American iconography, as well as Christian, Judeo-Christian, and in the case of now, what I've kind of come back to is Western esoteric mysticism in there, and yoga, since I'm a yoga teacher and a Reiki master. So how would I put all that together without some sort of idea of how they come together for myself? I am the catalyst, right? You are the catalyst for all these different things. You don't have to think about them as little boxes, separated from each other and incongruent with each other. Because you, yourself, you and your spiritual walk, your spiritual journey is the glue that puts this mandala together. It's all of your different experiences with each one of these different traditions or modes of thinking or modes of experience or awareness. It's your failures within them. It's your successes within them. And it's a beautiful way of exploring spirituality because it takes a lot of the pressure off. You don't have to fit into a box. And it's better if you don't try to. Because the box that worked for Muhammad, the box that worked for Paul, the box that worked for Siddhartha isn't going to work for you necessarily. There may be truth within them. And that is wonderful. And that's the great thing about having access like we do now to a wealth of information is you can pick up a book by Aleister Crowley. You can pick up a book about Merlin, or you can pick up a book about Mikao Usui and find some truth in it. But ultimately, the catalyst is you. You have to take what those teachers were teaching and put it into practice in your own life. And if you can do that, then you can achieve incredible, amazing things. Not only liberation for yourself, but liberation for others in many ways. And so my challenge, should you choose to accept it, is for you to start to explore these three pillars. What is your deep connection? How can you heal the trauma of domestication? And how can you start to explore things that seem divergent? Which, now I'm kind of spirit inspired right now. The fourth pillar, that way you can have a full temple, is integration and synthesis between these things. That is the essence of integrative spirituality. And I want to thank everybody who popped in to watch this live. We'll be doing a lot more of this in the future, like I said, particularly around our next big event on May 1st, May Day, Bielchina. We'll have more about that coming out soon, but thank you so much. Namaste.